Boar's Head invites you to enlighten your senses. Introducing Boar's Head Ichiban Teriyaki-style chicken. Inspired by Japanese master chefs, our signature teriyaki glaze is crafted with garlic, ginger, and a hint of brown sugar, then paired with our tender, slow-roasted chicken breast for a flavor that's sweet, savory, remarkably bold. Boar's Head Ichiban Teriyaki-style chicken, the bold flavor of Japan, now at the deli. Compromise elsewhere.
Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Healing X Outreach. I'm your host, Augustine Estacio, and today we are going to have a debate. For those of you that are probably listening for the first time, I just want to give you several avenues you can listen to today's program. This is a joint venture with the Six Screens Telenetwork line, and we encourage you to go ahead and also join us on a chat room video suite. So if you go in the chat room video suite, you should be able to see me. I think it's only me and Rick there right now. And you can see that in the advertisement under www.sixscreensofthewatchtower.com/telenetwork/directions.php. You can also listen by phone either by the Six Screens hotline at 712-432-8710, and then when prompted, dial 9925. Or you can listen through the Blog Talk line, which is 347-934-0379. Just to give you an idea, we have some other programming that we feature here on Healing X Outreach. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. we have the Sunday dinner, and that is 2 sermons that I give at my church that I pastor, and I give it for those that are considering Christianity. So it's Sunday dinner for ex-cultists considering Christianity, and tomorrow's topics on tomorrow's topics will be the resurrection of the unrighteous and the doctrine of eternal punishment, and also the body of Christ, diverse faith and unity in Christ. So those are going to be the 2 sermons tomorrow that will be given. And every first and third Wednesday, you can go ahead and join us at 7 o'clock Eastern Time for what is called the Community Bible Study. And we're currently in Romans chapter 9. So Romans chapter 9 this Wednesday, and tomorrow at 6 o'clock, the Sunday dinner, and every second and fourth Tuesday, you have Melissa Bramer, and she does Hurting to Healing program, and she just did one on Tuesday interviewing a former Jehovah's Witness elder, Bob Gray, who is also a co-organizer for the Witnesses Now for Jesus convention, which is held in October. So just check out your listings. If you really want to know about all the programs, we encourage you, subscribe to us and check out our archives at www.blogtalkradio.com/healing, the letter X, outreach. So Healing X Outreach. And you can also listen to us on iTunes. So when you subscribe or follow us at either that page or on iTunes, you'll get a notification into your listening device or by email of when the next program is going to begin, and some details about what it's about. So without further ado, let me just go ahead and introduce today's debate opponents and the topic. The topic is going to be on the topic of icons in worship. Is the use of icons idolatry or acceptable in worship? And our two debaters is Turretinfan, and you can go ahead and check out his YouTube page at youtube.com/user/Turretinfan, or at his blog site, which is turretinfan.blogspot.com. We also have, and Turretinfan is a Reformed apologist, Reformed Protestant. William Albrecht is our Catholic, defending the use of icons, and he has a BA in theology, is a member of the Catholic Apostolate, the Catholic Legate, and you can find out about him at Catholic-legate.com, or check out his YouTube page at youtube.com/GNRhead. And so, just want to see if both of our 830, that's you, William, right?
That is correct. I'm here.
Okay. And Turretinfan?
I'm also here.
Okay, great.
Great.
So, as usual, just let those listeners know how we format our debates. Our debates are opened up with 2 7-minute openings. Then we have 2 5-minute rebuttals, 6 6-minute cross-exams, 2 7-minute closings, and then we'll take questions from the listeners. So be prepared to press 1 if you're on the 347-934-0379. If you're listening online, that's the number you have to dial. Or you can also dial in the 16 network and just address us 2 questions through there. And that number, once again, is 712-432-8710. And just dial 9925. And then press 1 to unmute yourself on the 6-screen hotline. So, I take it, who's
I believe I'm going to be going first since I'm affirming.
Okay, yeah, okay. So,
is that correct, Turretinfan? I think we're
That's right, yep.
going first, right? Great, fantastic.
Okay, so you can begin now.
Okay, I will start now. Ezekiel 41, in Ezekiel's vision, and he said to me, "This is the most holy place. In front of the holy place was an altar." He said to me, "This is the table that stands before the Lord." The nave and the holy place had each a double door. On the doors of the nave were carved cherubim and palm trees, such as were carved on the walls. Exodus 20. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Today's debate is a very important one, which is precisely why I opened up with 2 very important footnotes of Scripture. And it is about a crucial subject. Are images that the ancient Christian churches use idolatrous? Do the historical scriptures show that the usage of images in a religious worship context is condemned? Absolutely not. Right after the 10 Commandments are handed down, after we hear that you shall not have any other gods, you shall not make for yourself a graven image, you have Exodus 20 telling us just what this means by the ordinances handed down to Moses. The Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves that I spoke with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver alongside me, nor shall you make for yourself gods of gold." God spoke from heaven, handing down his commandments, and the commandments were clear. You shall not make gods of silver or gods of gold. No graven images that are to be worshipped. The Lord God was clear, though, as in Ezekiel's vision. The holy place could be adorned with images, with carved images. Right in the midst of the altar of worship, images were present in Ezekiel's vision. So why was this not idolatry? Because the historical word is clear. The Bible is clear. The condemnation towards idolatry was towards idolatry, not towards images in totality. Furthermore, in Exodus 32, we read the sin of the people who disobeyed the Lord their God. And he received the gold at their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a molten calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And Aaron said, "Let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people that they are set upon evil. For they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And I said to them, "Let any who have gold take it off." And they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. Now let us carefully examine what the idolatrous Israelites said to Aaron. "These are your gods." The calf, their god. And they gave credit to this idol for taking them out of the land of Egypt. The blasphemy. Aaron committed the grave sin of giving in and molding the gold into the idol. The reason that God condemned them was because the people of God had made the graven image of this calf into their fashioned god of gold, thus breaking the commandment of Exodus 20 of worshiping a false god through the making of graven images. And they bowed and gave latria, worship to this calf. Ancient Christianity does not do what the Israelites are condemned by God for doing. No divinity is given to any image, as the church is clear that such is idolatry. In fact, dulia, honor and service, is not given to images either, but rather to the saint or that which is being represented. The Catholic Church, and I will add, the Orthodox, do not teach that its statuary is God, as the Israelites did with the golden calf. As Konikov put it, if a rigorous interpretation of the second commandment was accepted as normative and orthodox, an attitude that shows an aniconia in practice and iconophobia in theory would then follow throughout Jewish history. But as we have seen, the opposite is true. In early Judaism, we have Josephus commenting on Jewish images. He shows an early Jewish distinction between idolatry and art. In his Antiquities, he says of a certain castle, it was very delightful, very ornamental. And during an expedition to this particular location, the ruins of this castle were found. In one of the surviving locations, massive lions that were sculpted in relief were found, either intact or partially intact. In 1 Maccabees 13, we read of Simon Maccabeus, who had built an ornate family museum ornamented with sculptures. The text reads, "For the pyramids he created a setting of tall columns on which there were carvings. Some of these carvings were of suits of armor, and some were of ships. It was a monument to the victories which travelers could visit." The Talmud speaks of a tradition about ancient coins carrying sculpted images. Our rabbis taught, it says, what is the coin of Jerusalem? David and Solomon on one side, and Jerusalem, the holy city, on the other. And what is the coin of Abraham our father? An aged man and woman on one side, and a youth and a maiden on the other. The Jews mention coins with images in the Talmud and the Midrash, and not once condemn them. Rather, are at times venerated. It is a fact proven through historical examination that the Jews never adopted as normative a rigorous interpretation of the second commandment. Kaufman from the Jewish Quarterly Review writes, sculpted images have always been used in synagogues. Always been used. This is the same as it is also relevant in the early Christian church, where the fathers understood the condemnation of the second commandment and understood the difference between idolatry and veneration. We see an acceptance of images in a religious context consistently. And I will go into that further in my rebuttal period and hopefully in my cross-examination. I will now give way to my friend Turretinfan for his opening. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Turretinfan, you can go ahead with your opening statement.
Well, thanks very much. The question for today's debate is whether image veneration is biblical and historical. Well, of course, in a sense it is. In Genesis 31, we have our first reference to people having these images that they venerated when Rachel stole her quote-unquote gods from her father's house. Then in Genesis 35, we have the first purgation of these images when Jacob took them and hid them under the oak in Shechem. They were again forbidden by God during the Exodus, but when Moses delayed coming down from the mount, the people demanded an image, and Aaron complied by making one. In Exodus 32, we see the account of that. The Old Testament law is very explicit in forbidding these objects of veneration, not just in the second commandment, and I'm glad that Mr. Albrecht followed the correct enumeration of the commandments here, although the official Roman Catholic position is that commandment is part of the first commandment. But also in Exodus 34:17, Leviticus 19:4, 26:1, and so on. There's numerous condemnations of making any object of religious veneration as an image. The Old Testament does mention, for example, that there were, we'll come to this in a second, I guess. The Old Testament contains numerous warnings against idolatry, both explicit and implicit. Jeroboam, the first king of the 10 tribes, was a mighty man of valor and ordained by God himself to be their king. But as soon as Jeroboam put up idols for the worship of God, God turned against him, and that's recounted in 1 Kings 14. And he became known as Jeroboam, who made Israel to sin after that. And he's given an example of wickedness, and that's because he set up the veneration of the golden calves, which were supposed to represent Jehovah, just the same way that the golden calf that Aaron set up was supposed to represent Jehovah. There were, of course, images in a religious setting in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament the second commandment is wrongly interpreted. If it's wrongly interpreted as forbidding all art, absolutely. There were angels above the Ark of the Covenant, for example, but these images were not venerated. Another example would be the door that we mentioned, which had carved pomegranates and so forth. We could give many more examples. And yes, there's a distinction between having art and having pictures and having statues even, and venerating them. There's an important and real difference between those two things. And hopefully we won't be fighting a straw man of saying that the second commandment forbids, in its rigorous interpretation, all art. It doesn't forbid all art. It forbids only the making and veneration of images. Another example would be the brass serpent. The brass serpent was ordained by God, and people were miraculously cured when they looked at their bite from the fiery serpents, when they looked at the brass serpent. However, when people started venerating that serpent by burning incense to it, Hezekiah was praised for destroying it in 2 Kings 18. Indeed, Hezekiah was praised in the same place for moving all the unauthorized worship, including the high places, the groves, and the images. And that's the constant theme in the Old Testament. Even the Apocrypha, or deuterocanonical books, and parts are not an exception to that. The story of Bel in Daniel 14 makes mockery of the veneration of idols in a way that's roughly consistent with the canonical view of idol worship. And it is ridiculous. Tobit, Esther, the added parts of Esther, the Wisdom 14 has a long diatribe against an explanation of the foolishness of venerating images. And we see the same thing in Ecclesiasticus 30:19, the letter of Jeremiah has it. Both 1st and 2nd Maccabees contain only negative references to these objects of religious veneration. But what about the New Testament? Well, no surprise, the New Testament continues to be anti-idol. The dozens of references to images for veneration in the New Testament all depict the use of such images negatively. Paul repeatedly distinguishes Christian worship from that of the pagans by comparison to worship via images. For example, 1 Corinthians 12:2, you knew that ye were Gentiles, carried away unto these dumb idols, even as ye were led. And let's be clear, the idols and icons you see in churches today, whether those churches call themselves ancient or not, are just as unable to speak as those that Paul confronted. That's when preaching to the idolaters on Mars Hill, Paul said, Acts 17:24-31, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwells not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything. Seeing he gives to all life, breath, and all things, and is made of one blood, all nations of men, for to dwell upon the face of the earth, and has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord. If haply they may feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone graven by art and man's device. In the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he has ordained, whereof he has given assurance unto all men, in that he has raised him from the dead. So Paul doesn't announce a the idea that the Athenians should start worshiping crucifixes instead of statues of Diana or Jupiter. Instead, he points out that idol worship should be altogether shunned and that the living God should be worshipped. Do you remember the opposition that Paul got in Ephesus? It was because Demetrius the silversmith realized that Paul's message was iconoclastic. He wasn't going to have to melt down those silver shrines of Diana and repurpose them as silver crucifixes. Instead, if Paul's religion's right, there'd be no more demand for his work. John's first general epistle contains a blunt admonition, 1 John 5:21, little children, keep yourselves from idols. Amen. So then, the New Testament, is that the full time?
Yeah.
I'm hearing my timer going off. It looks like about 6 minutes has gone by.
No, you have 2 more minutes. Go ahead. Keep going.
All right.
Sorry about that.
So then the New Testament's fully consistent with the Old on this point. The Incarnation did not change the rules. It didn't suddenly make the veneration of images okay. Instead, they remain forbidden. But what about the early church? Eventually, image worship did creep into the early church as well. Augustine in Sermon 198 comments on the fact that there are people in his time that are adoring columns and images, but he decries that and says he wishes that they wouldn't. I won't go into the whole account because of time, but it had begun to creep in then, and later on we see that it did become quite widespread until the Seventh so-called Ecumenical Council actually endorsed the use of such images. But it's not really until the end of that patristic period that we see a church father defending the veneration of images. So the first one you can really see where it's a clear example of an authentic writing of one of these church fathers is John of Damascus in the 8th century defending the veneration of images. And that's not based on just my own reading. We tried to verify that there weren't some better sources out there. You may find some people making references to idols or images before then, but in terms of people saying that it's okay to venerate them, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find something before the 8th century, maybe some questionable citation from Basil, and that's about it. So what's the exact day? It's hard to pin down an exact time. There's some early examples of Christian art, some of which I would think is inappropriate, but nevertheless, we don't have examples of anyone venerating these images with approval in the Orthodox or Catholic churches of those times. In other words, churches that followed the universal faith or that held to Orthodox doctrines. I'm not referring to the modern denominations by those names. Is the veneration of such images so I suppose I should point out that the historians have concluded basically the same kind of thing, that image worship wasn't in the early church and that it eventually developed in. In fact, it was somewhat of a shock when people found an ancient church of some kind at a site called Dura Europos. Unfortunately, ISIS has now destroyed that excavation site. But those who had excavated it concluded it was probably originally destroyed. The town was originally destroyed in the middle of the 3rd century, which would make it the earliest example we have of a decorated Christian church, assuming that it's really Christian and assuming that all the dating is correct. So is the veneration of images biblical and historical? Well, there's certainly been a lot of it in history, and it's mentioned in the Bible, but the Bible condemns it, and our best historical reconstruction of the early church, based on the writings that are provided to us, suggests they didn't venerate images.
Okay, now we'll have the 2 5-minute rebuttals. And
Okay.
I guess William will be the first rebuttal.
Yes, correct. I will begin now. Thank you for that opening, Turretinfan. I appreciate it very much. Although I must argue that Turretinfan, again, confuses veneration for worship. As Turretinfan well knows, dulia, a term quite often used for veneration, of course, is also used for worship. But it is not an exclusive term for worship. We must understand the confusion you made over and over. Latria is the only word that can be used for worship, proper worship. Dulia must be and is used towards service to God, but it can also be applied to fellow brethren. And again, to comment on Turretinfan's opening statement, he says that the official Roman Catholic position is that the second commandment is not the second, that rather it is part of the first. Well, just for Turretinfan to be aware, the church does not have an official position on the ordering of the commandments. And if Turretinfan was aware of the Council of Trent and of 2 Nicaea, he would not have made that elementary error. Moving on to the serpent The serpent was not venerated. The serpent was worshipped. That was idolatry. The serpent became an idol. That's why it was destroyed. The serpent became an idol. Again, Turretinfan confusing images for idols. He says that the Deuterocanon condemns images. Well, it does condemn idols, but there's a big difference. I just read a passage in 1 Maccabees where Simon is shown as having built an ornate museum to give honor. To give honor. Again, a simple confusion of the biblical terms. He mentions how the early church was against idols. Yeah, I agree, the early church has always been against idols. But has the early church always been against images? Images used in a religious context, in churches, images that these individuals would have on their own person? Well, as early as the 2nd century, the great Clement of Alexandria said, "And let our seals be either a dove or a fish or a ship, strutting before the wind or a musical lyre, which Polycrates used, or a ship's anchor, engraved as a device. And if there be one fishing, he will remember the apostle and the children drawn out of the water." So these images should bring to mind the apostles. In a passage from the Discourse on the Resurrection by Methodius, preserved by John of Damascus, we read, "For example, even though the images of the emperor are not all made from gold or silver or precious metals, they are always honored by everyone. Men are not honoring the materials from which they are made. They do not choose to honor one image more than another because it is made from a more valuable substance. They honor the image, whether it is made of cement or bronze. If you should mock any of them, you will not be judged differently for mocking plaster or gold, but for showing contempt to your King and Lord. We make golden images of God's angels, principalities and powers, to give glory and honor to him." Eusebius, they say that this statue is an image of Jesus. It has remained to our day, so that we ourselves also saw it when we were staying in the city. Nor is it strange that those of the Gentiles who of old were benefited by our Savior should have done such things, since we have learned also that the likenesses of his apostles, Paul and Peter, and of Christ himself are preserved in paintings. The ancients being accustomed, and it is likely, according to the habit of the Gentiles, to pay this kind of honor indiscriminately to those regarded by them as believers. St. Augustine goes against idolatry. I agree with Turretinfan. Augustine lamented idolatry that was present in his time, lamented it most likely within the church and out of the church. But the problem with Turretinfan's and any Reformed position when it comes to Augustine is that Augustine goes against idolatry, not the condemnation of images in a rigorous manner at all. In his controversy with the Manichaeans, he makes that clear. He says that he talks about images. He says, I believe it was, he's talking about the sacrifice of, he said, "For Abraham to sacrifice his son of his own accord is shocking madness. His doing so at the command of God proves him faithful and submissive. This is so loudly proclaimed by the very voice of truth that Faustus, eagerly rummaging for some fault and reduced at last to slanderous charges, has not the boldness to attack this action. It is scarcely possible that he can have forgotten a deed so famous that it recurs to the mind of itself without any study or reflection, and is in fact repeated by so many tongues and portrayed in so many places." And there are many, many more examples of such icon usage in the early church. And I will go deeper into it in my cross-steps and in my closing. For now, I will surrender the rest of my time to Turretinfan. Thank you.
Okay, Turretinfan, you can go ahead with your 5-minute rebuttal.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks very much. I think it's very telling that we have not yet heard one scripture passage that is spoken favorably of venerating images. There's been some false accusations about conflating categories, but but what's missing is actually any biblical passage suggesting we ought to, or should, or even may venerate images. Not one passage suggests we should or may venerate images. So as far as the scriptural testimony, it's universally against the veneration of images, and the same thing with the patristic sources. Even the ones that were just cited now in the rebuttal, not one of them speaks favorably of venerating images. Some of them talk about making some portrayals. It's interesting to mention talking about making an anchor or a fish. I mean, those are obviously not, it should be obvious that those aren't images to be venerated. They're just images that are somehow and vaguely in a religious context. And the same thing with all these other selections, even the one from Eusebius, which happens to be one of the few that talks about making an image of Jesus himself, doesn't say anything about anyone religiously venerating that image. Now, perhaps people did, and if they did, they oughtn't to have. But again, of course, Eusebius is now, we're talking about the roughly the 4th century. So as far as whether it was an apostolic tradition, it wasn't an apostolic tradition. It was this practice of religiously venerating images came later. It's not an ancient tradition. Going back to the constructive speech, as we mentioned a little bit in my constructive speech, the temple did have various images. Yes, we acknowledge that. And if someone wants to carve pomegranates and so forth on the doors of their church, although we don't suggest that, we're not supposed to return back to the temple worship. New Testament worship is simpler and more spiritual than Old Testament worship, which was in the types and shadows. And so we don't go back to a system of priests and so forth. We actually have more pure worship now because the shadows are gone and Christ has come. But if you did carve pomegranates, that's not what we're concerned about. And if you had statues of angels, like some of these Mormon temples have a statue of the angel Moroni over their church, that itself isn't a Second Commandment violation unless you venerate the image. The problem is when you make images that purport to be of God and you venerate those images. That's the clear violation of the Second Commandment. So that's what we're opposed to, is this religious veneration of images. I didn't mention the issue of whether dulia constitutes worship or not, but whether or not it does, there is religious veneration of these images, and that's the inescapable problem. I gave a specific example of what constituted in religious veneration, which is the burning of incense before them, and that's exactly what the kind of thing that you see happening in churches that call themselves ancient churches. Those churches use incense. They don't necessarily burn it directly in front of one of the icons, although perhaps it's done. There's often candles burnt in front of the icons. So often these icons are kissed. It's very clear that religious veneration of these images and icons is going on. And it's a little bit of a word game to say, well, what we're offering is just dulia, not latria, because these are images of mere men. But of course, if the image of a mere man receives one thing, and then presumably the image that's purporting to be an image of Christ would receive something different. And in fact, the terms for worship aren't, of course, limited to only the word latria, but proskuneo is also used as a Greek word to describe worship. And this prostration before images is what's condemned broadly. So we're not supposed to offer only one kind of religious veneration to images. And in fact, although the Jews were perhaps not as iconoclastic as they're sometimes portrayed, and as later rabbinic Judaism obviously is, if you've looked at those later rabbinic Jewish synagogues, they're completely devoid of any kind of images. Nevertheless, the Jews that in all these examples aren't making images of Jehovah or Yahweh. So there's no images of God in all of these things. So if there are some coins that have pictures of Abraham and Sarah on them, okay, but there's no picture of Jehovah on them. And the reason is because the Second Commandment clearly forbids that, and we haven't been told something different. Mr. Albrecht wants to draw a line between idols and images. Of course, that's a line drawn just because idols are what pagans do and images are what Christians do in his way of using words. But eidolon doesn't have some kind of specialized meaning that excludes it's like a different kind of image. It's the same kind of image. The question is its purpose, and its purpose is religious veneration. So not all images are absolutely forbidden. The type of images that are forbidden are images for religious veneration. That's what distinguishes just a statue of a lion from a lion that's supposed to be a false god, is whether somebody's offering religious veneration to it. And I see that I'm out of time, so.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to begin with the cross exams. And William, you will begin cross-examining Turretinfan.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Turretinfan. Turretinfan, I want to move on to I'm pretty sure you own the Institutes of Electic Theology. I want to actually point to Francis Turretin's statements in this volume 2. Francis Turretin affirms that religious images in sacred places are prohibited by the second commandment. Yet he says something interesting to me. He says, we do not condemn historical representations of events or of great men. Turretinfan, would a representation of the crucifixion be acceptable inside of a church?
In terms of what I've presented in my argument was focused on the religious veneration of images. So if you're there's a slightly different debate about whether we should even make any images of God at all, much less venerate them. I'm really focusing my arguments on the question of veneration. So these are two different arguments. I do agree with Turretin's position that although we can make historical accounts of things, but if we include in those historical accounts images of someone purporting to be God, then those are inappropriate. But that's so the picture of the crucifixion from an angle where you can't see Christ wouldn't have a problem as far as the making of such images, even if you didn't venerate them. And then there's an internal debate among Protestants and Reformed people about whether you can even make such historical representations. So, but that's kind of a debate for another day.
I completely understand your question. I mean, your answer. The reason I am going to include these questions is I'm going to relegate myself to when Francis Turretin speaks of religious images in sacred places, as Roman Catholics and Orthodox do connect the veneration with sacred places. So my question was simply not whether or not, I understand the debate is on veneration, but whether or not it would be acceptable to have this scene. As Francis Turretin says, and I believe you agree, there's no issue, because you did say in your opening statement, there's no problem with, historical events per se. But you made a very interesting statement right now. You said that that you don't know if perhaps to present the crucifixion would be fine, but I guess not to picture Christ, that would not be okay?
Yes, what my concern about these line of questions is that they're not cross-examining what I said and that they're distracting from the topic of the debate. But, to answer your question, the position espoused by Turretin, I believe, and certainly the position expressed by the Westminster Standards, is that any picture of any person of the Godhead is forbidden. So even in a historical context, it's forbidden. But certainly this is an intra-Reformed debate over whether images of the second person of the Trinity in his humanity are permitted in terms of merely historical reconstructions. So I do agree with Westminster Standards on that point, but it's not really essential to this debate.
Okay. Turretin, Francis Turretin says in the whole section that he's touching upon sacred and religious images, he says that God expressly forbids this in the second commandment. He then says that images are not just prohibited as objects of worship, which of course does connect into this debate, that is, in terms of idolatrous images, but that inasmuch as they are made simply for the sake of religion or are set up in sacred places. Seeing as to the fact that I do connect, ancient Christianity does connect veneration of images with the sacred, with holy places, if God expressly forbade such images, why do we find them in Ezekiel's temple, in Ezekiel 41?
Yeah, I think there's a misunderstanding there. That obvious. I mean, it should be apparent to anyone who's read any Reformed commentaries on the Mosaic tabernacle and on David's temple that we're well aware that God specifically ordained there to be, for example, statues of angels inside the temple, and that's a sacred space, and those are images in that sacred space. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not those images are to be venerated, and such veneration is prohibited.
I completely understand what you're saying. My question is not with David. I'm particularly speaking about Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel 41. And I'm connecting that with the fact that Francis Turretin says that sacred and religious images are forbidden, and they're forbidden in sacred places. Do you disagree with him? In this case, do you disagree with him? Because here we have sacred and religious images in a sacred place. So would you disagree with Francis Turretin then?
I'm loath to take a position on whether I disagree with the representation made of Turretin. My point is, all the Reformed churches acknowledge that in the temple worship there were images, and that those were appointed by God and totally appropriate. So I'm absolutely certain that Turretin doesn't say Ezekiel was wrong, and that Ezekiel's temple.
No, I didn't say that. Yeah, I didn't say that. No, I was wondering. No, he does not touch upon it. I don't believe he touches upon Ezekiel 41. My only question was that comparing what he says to what the Bible says, I believe this is a clear contradiction. Is it not? Can you give me your commentary on that, perhaps?
On something I haven't read in a long time, whose context I don't remember. I don't have a copy of of that section of his institute in front of me. No, I'd rather not give my opinion on something I haven't read, but or read recently. So, I'll just reiterate the point which I said before, which is the argument I've made in the debate, which is that we are not to venerate images.
Okay, Turretinfan, Ezekiel 41 gives us a vision of a temple with carved cherubim.
Yes.
Are cherubim angelic beings that are consonant with worship and praise of God?
Cherubim are angelic beings that worship God. They
Correct.
worship God. The cherubim do. Yeah, the cherubim do.
Absolutely, I agree. Okay. That's it for my time.
So we'll have Turretinfan cross-examine William Albrecht.
All right. Mr. Albrecht, do you have any examples in the Bible where people are told that they ought to venerate images?
Where they're told that they ought to venerate images? I don't believe the text says that anywhere.
Do you have any examples in the early church fathers before John of Damascus where any of the fathers defend the veneration of images?
Well, first off, just to answer your point in totality, we need to realize that as Nicaea II, basing itself on the fathers and the scriptures pointed out, veneration comes in many forms. And like the Greek Eusebius, as well as Duliuo connected with it, it is something that points to God. So religious and sacred statuary, for instance, in heaven, in the temple of God, as we see in the book of Revelation, or in a holy temple near holy locations, that is something that does point to God and does point to God's glory. So that in and of itself would be sufficient for religious veneration. Images used in the sacred locations. So yes, and I did point to Clement of Alexandria. I'm not too sure if you were able to catch that. I think there were a lot more fathers, but Clement is one example. And I do believe that the instructor, you can look that up right now, I might be wrong, but I'm almost certain that every place that dates that from Clement dates that to the 2nd century. So
what is it that Clement said that you're pointing me to?
What is it that Clement said? Oh,
yes.
He says exactly. Do you want me to quote what he says?
Yes, please.
Absolutely. He says, "And let our seals be either a dove or a fish or a ship scudding before the wind. Before the wind, or a musical lyre which Polycritus used, or a ship's anchor, engraved as a device. And if there be one fishing, he will remember the apostle and the children out of water." As I was mentioning, I believe in my my rebuttal, the mere fact that Clement of Alexandria has no issue with these images used, especially the image of a fish, as well as some argue, he is commenting on these images in order to have individuals, I guess, how can I put it? I guess have their emotions moved and have them remember and recall the apostles, as he himself says, if there be one fishing, he will remember the apostles. Okay. So, I mean, I think, again, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No problem. So do you see the difference between putting wearing a ring with a ixus on it and the use of icons in Orthodox churches or images and and statues in Roman Catholic churches. Do you see the difference between those things, or are those all the same to you?
That's a fantastic question, and I thank you for it. There is a difference. The difference is first off, there is something very similar. The fact that there is no issue with images, we find this as early as the 2nd century church. And then the difference is, I grant that Clement of Alexandria is not speaking of perhaps an image or a statue of Christ, but the fact that Clement of Alexandria does speak in more than one location at that of images in a positive manner, images that were being used in the church at this early point in time, does show you that the early church was aware of the difference between images and idols. Excuse me. I think the early church knew that difference quite well.
Where does the early church make that? You said they're well aware of it. So where does the early church make that distinction between images and idols? What's an example of someone making that distinction?
That's a great question, and I think it's answered if you look up Clement of Alexandria. I know I don't want to take up much of your time, but I can pull it up in a little bit. If you look up Clement, who I just brought up, if you look up Augustine, who you brought up, and you look at many other fathers, the fathers that had positive statements that they said about images also had negative things to say about idols. And when they were commenting on pagan idols, for instance, pagan idolatry, that's one thing that I'm looking at, that Clement of Alexandria commented on quite frequently, and he would bring up the second commandment. So that in and of itself shows that Clement, Augustine, and the early church knew the difference between images themselves that were permitted to be used in religious and sacred contexts and idols. Idols, for instance, like the golden calf, which was set up to be used instead of God, in God's stead.
The Nicaea II that you reference, you're aware that this is an 8th century council, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so aside from the place of Nicaea, that place name, there's no connection with the Council of Nicaea that produced the Nicene Creed.
Oh,
correct?
Definitely not.
So,
yes.
and before that council, Nicaea II, there was a similarly sized council, maybe 30 years before, that took the opposite position, right?
I'm going to disagree, but I will carry. You can carry that on, and I guess maybe I can touch upon that in my cross-examination.
Okay.
Okay. I believe it's my cross-examination now.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that, Turretinfan. And I'm trying to grab my paper here. Okay, fantastic. Okay, here we go. Turretinfan, going right back to Francis Turretin, and I apologize. I find his writings to be very interesting. Francis Turretin says, "We condemn here the treatment of sacred or religious images that are supposed to contribute something to the excitement of religious feeling." And I think that gets right to the heart of veneration, because images, that is the whole point. It's supposed to contribute something to religious feeling. So I'm going to continue a little bit longer before I read the question. It's according to 1 Chronicles 28, 18 and 19, where it reads, "The golden chariot of the cherubim that spread their wings and covered the ark of the covenant of the Lord." Would you say that this text includes religious images that contribute to religious feeling?
Generally, the Ark of the Covenant and its cherubim were hidden from view within the holiest of holies. The only person that would go in there would be the high priest once a year. So, strictly speaking, those images, those in particular, never particularly contributed to the normal person's religious experience, because they weren't seen. But there were plenty of other images in the pomegranates and so forth that were seen and that contributed to that religious experience, and that's not what Turretin's talking about in terms of talking about images that it contributes to the religious experience. He's talking about, in New Testament worship, images that aren't appointed by God for that purpose. That's a different question than the question of veneration of images. It's related in that both relate to the worship of God and what's the proper worship of God, and that we shouldn't innovate in the worship of God. But it's a slightly more debatable point, and it's one that is debated within Reformed circles, whether or not we should in any way innovate in terms of adding images during a religious context. So if you took Turretin's point there quite strictly, you wouldn't even include it on a PowerPoint presentation of the Psalms. If you're preaching through the historical portions, you wouldn't put a PowerPoint picture of somebody portraying David up on the screen, even though it's a transient image and so forth, because that would be a very rigid interpretation of that point that would be kind of an innovation that wasn't ordained by God. That's more debatable.
Can you include a picture of Christ in a PowerPoint presentation?
See, now, so that's the most debatable point was whether you could innovate by including pictures in general. What would be less debatable would be whether you should include pictures purporting to be of God. Of course, you couldn't actually put a picture of Christ there because no one has authentic picture of Christ from which to make one.
A representation of Christ. Could you include a representation of Christ in a PowerPoint presentation?
You ought not to. That's different from venerating that image, which is a more serious and clearly wrong thing. That's the topic of today's debate. The debate is here over the veneration of such images, not over the making of them.
Right. As I asked you in my previous cross-examination, Francis Turretin says that there's no problem including, historical representations of great men. That is precisely why my question would be, if you can include a historical, perhaps a representation of a great man, wouldn't Christ be considered a great man? And would that not lead to perhaps individuals venerating that image if that were provided?
Well, I'm not a consequentialist, but although that might be a prudential consideration, if you think something's going to tempt someone to sin, then if you think something's going to tempt someone to sin, then you shouldn't do it. But Christ is more than just a great man. He's also the second person of the Trinity, and it's an historian error to split those two, to treat him as a human being and separately God. Yeah.
I agree. 100% I agree. No argument at all. Turretinfan, the cherubim over the ark, the carved images, religious images, do these not serve a religious purpose? Are they not used in the presence of the sacred?
They're in a sacred space, they're used for a religious purpose, and they're not venerated.
Okay. Turretinfan, how would you define the word veneration, as there are many Greek words for it which translate over to it? Could you give us your definition of veneration in a nutshell?
Yeah, in Greek words?
No. I mean, it can be in English.
I like Latin, which cultus is a nice Latin word. But in English, veneration is a good word. In Greek, we have not only latria, but also proskuneo is another example of a word that relates to veneration. As I mentioned before, a specific example is the burning of incense to the essentially in front of, before this item. When you put a rose as a gift in front of a statue or something like that, that's an example of veneration of the statue. Of course, few people are so foolish as to actually believe that the statue itself is the god. Even correct. The most uneducated pagans realize that this is supposed to represent their god, and we don't think that Orthodox and Roman Catholics think that their statues or icons are actually Jesus, but that they represent him. But the problem is exactly the same problem.
Yet they are still. You just admitted right now, and I appreciate that Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox do not believe their icons and images to be actual gods. Yet you still believe that this is idolatry. Why is that? Can you explain that to us?
Because for the exact same reason that the Greeks, when Demetrius built a little Diana out of silver, he didn't think that's the actual Diana. He thought that Diana is an actual goddess. Some of these, very sophisticated Greeks thought that the moon was the actual goddess, and that Diana just represents the moon. But at least the ones who believed that there were actual gods believed that there was an actual Diana, but this is just an image of her, in the same way that people don't believe that the Shroud of Turin is actually Jesus. They just like to treat it as though it pictures Jesus.
Okay. Your cross-examination right now.
If I understood your argument correctly, what your interpretation of the second commandment is that it prohibits the making of gods other than Jehovah. In other words, your interpretation seemed to rely on the idea that when it says you shall not make unto yourselves any graven images, that's referring not to images of Jehovah, but rather that's referring to images of Ashtaroth and so forth, these other false gods.
No,
did I correctly understand
you? No, actually, let me explain it briefly. And thank you for that question. It's a very good question. The commandment which appears in Exodus 20, various other places as well, but particularly Exodus 20, I believe it's rather clear where it says, you shall have no other gods before me. So the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox position would be real simple. It's that when the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves that I spoke with you from heaven, you shall not make gods of silver alongside me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. It's real simple that the reason God condemned them was because the people of God had made the graven image into the calf, and they'd made it into a god. It wasn't simply just an image. They had made it into a god. So the Catholic Church does not teach, as you admitted yourself, that its statuary is God, as the Israelites did with the golden calf. So I think there's a very clear difference between idols and images in that sense, because after this commandment is handed down, as we've seen and as you've well admitted, images, statues appear numerous times throughout the historical Word of God.
Do you think that the Israelites thought that the golden calf was actually a deity and not a representation of a deity?
Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And out came the golden calf, their God, and they gave credit to this idol for taking them out of the land of Egypt. Absolutely, yes, they did. I think the biblical text is quite clear.
Okay, so, all right. Now, when you understand that text that way, how would you then treat Deuteronomy 4, verse, and I'll read it to you so you don't have to look up unless you want to, of course. Deuteronomy 4 is the chapter, and then starting at verse 15, take ye therefore good heed unto yourselves, for ye saw no manner of similitude on the day that the Lord spake unto you in Horeb out of the midst of the fire, lest ye corrupt yourselves and make you a graven image, the similitude of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any beast that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged fowl that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water beneath the earth, and lest thou lift up thine eyes into heaven, when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the hosts of heaven, shouldst be driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord thy God hath divided unto all nations under the whole heaven. So, in this place where God states that they didn't, where you saw no manner of similitude on the day the Lord spake unto you, how was that relevant to them not making a graven image, if the concern is simply that they're going to use the image to replace God?
Okay, very, very good question. As we've already, as I've demonstrated already a number of times in my opening, my cross-ex, my rebuttal, the making itself of statues or of images for religious purposes is not condemned. We find that in 1 Kings, we find it in Chronicles, we find that in Ezekiel 41. Right. And so the question is great. What about statues or images that are of God?
No, the question is, what's the point of this, for you saw no manner of similitude, if the problem is replacing God? Yeah.
Right, I'm getting precisely to that. Early in the history, and as you're well known, the Israelites were forbidden to make any depictions of God. And it's clear, I think you've made the point a number of times in your opening statement and in your cross-ex. God had not revealed himself in a visible form. So knowing exactly what this culture was that was surrounding the pagans, they might have been, as they were, actually, I'm wrong, they were tempted to worship an animal in some form. But as we do see in the scriptures, God does reveal himself later on under many different forms, as we can see in Daniel 7:9, where it says, I believe it says, as I looked, thrones were placed, and one that was Ancient of Days took his seat. His raiment was white as snow, and his hair of his head was pure as wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. So as we can see, there are depictions later on, particularly in this case of the Father, under this form. So we can see later on that case would not be applicable. And again, that case sticks directly to idolatry in and of itself. So I think, again, using Deuteronomy 4, I don't think it has much, I don't think it really proves any point other than idolatrous images were prohibited. And before God was revealed in visible form, it was prohibited to make an image, a representation of him.
Did Jacob wrestle with God? Did Abraham meet God? Were those visible representations?
Biblical representations, absolutely. But again, notice exactly what you're saying. You're speaking of a biblical representation of God, which of course, and in this case, we're speaking about a depiction of God in visible form. There's quite a difference there. Okay. I believe it's my final cross-examination. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Your final cross-examination.
Okay. All right. Turretinfan, can you open your book to Revelation chapter 11?
Yes.
Fantastic. Turretinfan, in Revelation 11:19, we read that the prophet saw the temple of God in heaven, and in heaven was the ark. Turretinfan, Revelation 11:19 says the prophet saw God's temple in heaven open, and the ark of his covenant was within the temple. According to what Francis Turretin says, where he says, but here we treat of sacred and religious images which are supposed to contribute something to the excitation of religious feeling. Images are prohibited not only in as much as they are the object or the means of worship, but in as much as they are made simply for the sake of religion or are set up in religious places. Turretinfan, if Francis Turretin was correct, how can there be carved images in heaven in the very temple of God?
If Turretin's correct, then those can be there by God specifically ordaining them. And that question kind of assumes a lot about how to interpret Revelation 11:19 in terms of interpreting it as a literal reference to a literal ark in heaven, which isn't the traditional view of that text among the fathers, as I'm sure you're aware.
What is the traditional view of that text? Could you read the earliest interpretation of that text for us?
The earliest. Let's see. I think I have it here. Let me see. Actually, I may have it at my other desk. I'm trying.
Because you're seeing that
origin
this is not
commentary.
the traditional view of this text.
I guess my point is that there's basically two main traditional lines of interpreting Revelation. One of them is about things that are about to happen. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just clarify one question before you continue, just so you can understand what I'm asking. I'm asking, are you of the persuasion, before you answer me, that this is not the actual Ark of the Covenant? Is that what you're getting to? I'm kind of confused.
What I'm getting to is that the typical interpretation that and as I said, there's multiple interpretations of Revelation, but the typical ones I've seen are allegorical interpretations, not literal interpretations, for a number of reasons, but especially because there's all kinds of things which don't seem on their face to be literal statements.
Okay. The church in fact, let me try and get to that. I kind of lost my place here. Okay. God's temple in heaven opened, and the Ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. What is allegorical about this particular verse, Turretin, Ben?
What's allegorical about the verse? Well, it's part of a vision of... Yeah, go ahead.
It's part of a heavenly vision. I would argue that it is speaking about the actual Ark, and I would argue that this is a proof that there are actual carved images in heaven. Would you agree with that point?
Even assume, well, I think that the Ark of the Testament is Christ, so I think this is allegorical, but regardless, even if John is talking here about an actual box, and that this box looks like the one that was in the Old Testament temple, and that it has gold cherubim carved on top of it, even so, I think that might have a little bit of problems for Turretin's point on having religious images in a church at all, but it wouldn't have a problem with the topic of our debate about venerating those images, because no one's told to venerate the cherubim on top of the Ark of the Testament.
Okay, Turretinfan, so you would disagree with Francis Turretin on that point then?
No, I'm not saying I disagree with Francis Turretin on that point. I'm saying that it's not part of the topic of our debate, that it is an intramural Reformed debate on that topic, and that it distracts from the topic of the debate when we keep bringing up these other somewhat tangential points, and it's likely to confuse people. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because I'm kind of confused. I would admit myself. I believe that the Ark of the Covenant, which, as you well know, had carved images of angels on top.
Right.
And we have this vision in heaven, in the temple of God. And I would believe that this question pertains very much to the debate, because these images, this is as sacred as it gets, I imagine. Images in heaven, in the very temple of God. Where does this text imply that the Ark is Christ?
Okay, so to answer the first part of the question, it's never been our position, that it's never been the position I've expressed during this debate, that the veneration of images itself prohibits the presence of images. And I've argued instead, quite to the contrary, that you can have a prohibition on veneration of images consistent with having images in sacred spaces, in the most sacred space, in the holiest of holies. There are cherubim, and yet those cherubim weren't venerated. The high priest didn't go into that sacred, most sacred of spaces and venerate those images. And if there are cherubim carved or molten or anything else in heaven, no one's venerating those images. And that's what distinguishes their use of images in those spaces, assuming a view of Revelation 11 that I don't necessarily agree with, because and why we think that is allegorical, and why we think Christ is the Ark of the Testament is mostly from that particular mapping, I believe, comes from Hebrews, not from Revelation. But the reason to think that things in Revelation are non-literal are things like calling Jesus the Lamb. He's not ovine in his in his nature. He's not a sheep. Yeah.
Turretinfan, are you aware that the Greek word eusebias, translated numerous times for veneration, that veneration is supposed to lead to godliness? It is supposed to lead to God, to lead one to God. That being said, how can these images not be in and of themselves a part of the sacred and pointing towards God, as veneration is supposed to do? How can images in the most sacred places, as you just admitted, how can they not lead towards God if that is exactly what veneration is?
Right. I think it's a simple conflation. I think almost everyone who's listening to discussion will see the difference between bowing down to a statue of a golden calf and bowing down to an empty space between two golden cherubim. And I think that difference is, I think that it's evident whether or not one tries to define veneration broadly as something that leads you towards God. And I don't think anyone who argued that they're bowing down to an image purportedly of Jehovah in the time of Moses would have been forgiven because they said that led them towards God.
Okay. That's good for my cross-examination time.
Yeah, we're going to have our closing.
No, I believe Turretinfan has his last question.
That's right.
I think so. Am I correct, Turretinfan? You have
I think so. I think you had first cross-examination, yeah.
Yes, that's correct, yes.
Yeah. So this is the last cross-exam. All right. Okay. So you can begin your cross-exam, Turretinfan.
I guess there's one quick point I wanted to try to clear up, if possible, which is the question of the enumeration of the commandments. I had pointed out that you had enumerated them the way that the Reformed churches teach that you should, and obviously I think that you're right in that point. And I think you had raised the idea that there isn't an official Roman Catholic enumeration of the commandments. Did I correctly understand you in saying that?
That is correct. In fact, I've got the Catechism of the Council of Trent right here in front of me, and I could actually look that up for you, and I could read that for you if you like. That's correct. So
would you not accept the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which has an enumeration of the commandments?
Are
that
you
not
under
official?
the impression that is official? But if you're under the impression that the Catechism of the Catholic Church, for instance, the latest edition released, is making an official proclamation that they must be enumerated in this manner and in no other manner, then you would be in error.
Okay. So do you acknowledge that the Catechism of the Catholic Church enumerates them the way I said the Catholic Church enumerates them?
I'm not exactly certain. I don't have the Catechism open in front of me, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay.
I think there was one question. It is your cross-examination. But there was one question you were going to ask me when you ran out of time. I think you were talking about the Council of Nicaea. You were talking about councils. And we ran out of time.
I mentioned that there was a council. You had mentioned that you weren't aware or you didn't agree with the idea that there was a council just before Second Nicaea that was a similar size.
Yes. That's your question. Okay, I forgot what the question was. I remember you. I remember you were talking about Nicaea too. I didn't remember what you were going to ask. So yeah, I disagree. Yes, I do disagree. You might catch me off guard on this. Maybe perhaps there is one. Maybe perhaps there's one that I was not able to find in my studies. But go ahead, you can ask.
In 754, there was a council held in Constantinople, a large council which argued that Satan misguided men so that they worshiped the creature instead of the creator. The Mosaic Law and the prophets cooperated to undo this ruin, but in order to save mankind thoroughly, God sent his own Son, who turned us away from error and the worshiping of idols and taught us the worshiping of God in spirit and in truth. As messengers of the saving doctrine, he left us the apostles and disciples, and these adorned the church, his bride, with his glorious doctrines. This ornament of the church, the Holy Fathers and the 6 ecumenical councils have preserved and violate. But the before-mentioned demiurgos of wickedness could not endure the sight of this adornment and gradually brought back idolatry under the appearance of Christianity. So this is from the council, the Iconoclastic Council, it's sometimes called.
Correct. That's exactly what it's called, yes.
And it had 338 members, so that's the one I was referring to. I think you're aware of that council, so in what sense did you deny what I said? Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize. I was under the impression that you were referring to an early church council, not an iconoclastic council, where, as you well know if you've done the research, there were a number of individuals that, even at that council, objected to the doctrine that was laid down. Of course, I would disagree with that council. I disagree with the mere fact that that iconoclastic council and individuals from that council had to bring up spurious documents from, for instance, Eusebius and other individuals, documents and texts that never existed before, basically bringing them up out of thin air to try to substantiate some sort of argument against images. That in and of itself, like Rimini and Salucha, which was the Arian council, that in and of itself, like that council, it should be discredited, and it is discredited amongst ancient Christian churches.
When you say that something is discredited among ancient Christian churches, I noticed that you cited Eusebius yourself in your statements, although he's sometimes condemned as a semi-Arian because he had some sympathies for that. So
that's correct.
As far as being a historical position within the Christian churches, the Iconoclastic Council would certainly be an example of that, whether you want to accept them or not, right?
In as much as there was a council that opposed Orthodox individuals, I agree, which would be the exact same thing as semi or full Arians arguing that the Council of Rimini was an actual part of history. Absolutely, it's a part of history. Is it an Orthodox part of history? No, that's a very big difference. It was both councils, to me, are similar in the sense that both had to bring up spurious documentation, dishonesty, to try to get their point across, points that were unorthodox and against ancient Christianity. So in a sense, it is part of history, but I don't see it as part of ancient history, and I don't think you have any proof of any early church council that condemned the usage of images. I just don't find that. And I've researched, and I just can't find that.
Can you find a church council before the Iconoclastic Council that approved of them? Because this is the first council that I found. It's not like Nicaea, where Nicaea is the first council, and then the Arian council comes afterwards. In this case, the Iconoclastic Council comes first, and the Dulic Council comes after.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that you bring up, because it goes further to hammer home the point and how little argument there was. As we see in Tertullian, there were images in churches, and these images were accepted. So that only goes as far as to show your point that there was, in the early church, there was such little contention and argument when it came to images used in proper religious and sacred services that we don't find a council until much later. So, yeah, I don't think there's any early church council, as far as I know, that even touches upon the usage of images. But we know they were used in sacred and religious services, not only in Christian churches but in Jewish. So I think that
doesn't that argument from silence cut both ways? I mean, maybe the point is that there is no debate over it because those images weren't venerated.
I don't think so. Because holding to the word veneration, again, as I pointed out, veneration comes in many forms. It can lead and it can point to godliness. It doesn't have to be something that somebody bows down to and kisses and prays towards the individual of. It is something, as the Greek word eusebias refers to, leads to godliness. So in that sense, as Tertullian himself, when he was a Montanist, is condemning the shepherd of Hermas, and he's pointing out of the shepherd on, I believe it was on a goblet. That in and of itself is part of veneration and does lead to godliness, something that is part of the very sacred, something that holds the most sacred in Christian services. So
do you see a difference between having a shepherd on your goblet and having an icon of Christ?
I don't know exactly what the goblet had, but and to be quite honest with you, I would not argue either which way in what Tertullian was saying. I'm not entirely certain if he's condemning the shepherd, because we all know that he had very unfavorable views towards the shepherd of Hermas, or if he's condemning the mere use of the image altogether. Okay.
All right. So that covers all the false exams, and we have some closing remarks, and then we'll open up the lines for callers to go ahead and ask questions. So who gives the first closing? Is that?
I'll be closing first.
Okay.
I believe that's what we agreed upon. I'll close first, and then Turretinfan follows. Okay. I will. How long are the closings? They're 5 minutes. Am I correct, or how long are they?
No, 7 minutes.
Fantastic. Great. I will begin now. Thank you very much for that very lively exchange, Turretinfan. I respect your views very much so, and I think they're very stimulating opinions that you have. But again, I disagree with them heavily. And I think a number of times I think we were able to get to the point, but a number of times it seems like we were talking past each other. But I think even though when it seems we were talking past each other, we were right on the correct wavelength. What is veneration? Exactly what is veneration? As Nicaea, too, basing itself on the Fathers and the Scriptures pointed out, veneration comes in many forms. And like the Greek word eusebias, duliuo, proskuneo, it is something that points to God, towards God. Religious and sacred statuary in heaven, in the temple of God, of God's messengers, is something that points to God and to God's glory. You can cut it either which way you want, any way you want, and say, oh, well, they're not bowing down to them. They're not lighting incense. They're not praying towards them. It doesn't matter which way you cut it. Veneration, it has many forms, many words used for veneration in the Bible, in the historical text. And if we follow and stick to the historical Word of God, there's there's a temple in heaven. We can agree upon that. And there is the Ark of the Covenant in heaven. Hebrews 9:4 says that the ark had the golden pot that had manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. Anything that points towards godliness, towards God, that is a form of veneration, either in the sense of the sacred, latria, or dulia, which dulia can be used of service towards God and towards the Christian brethren, not always in the worship form. I brought up Ezekiel 41. Images, carved angels on the walls of the church, carved angels. This is a problem for Protestant churches. And how do they respond? How do they respond? Well, they're not being venerated. People aren't bowing down before them. If you've got a problem, if you think that the second commandment is condemning images and then condemning them from being used in religious and sacred locations, yet you have it all throughout the Bible and the early Jewish history and the early church where images are being used in the churches, then you've got yourself a real contradiction in your theology. And I thought today's debate was a fantastic debate in the sense that ancient churches understood the difference between idolatry and images. Images aren't given worship. They're not even given dulia. Nobody gives an image any respect. I'm not going to bow down before an image and direct my prayers towards the image. That goes towards the prototype, as Basil says. We weren't able to get into that. But there are a number of quotes from the early church, from the pre-Nicene Fathers to the Nicene Fathers. What did Moses say? Turretinfan asked me, do you think these people really believe that the calf was their God? Well, what does the Bible say? What does the Bible say? To heck with Moses, who brought us out of the land of Egypt. We don't know what happened to him. This is our God, O Israel, it says. The calf brought us out of the land of Egypt. And you know what? It sounds ridiculous. It really does. That's because idolatry is a serious sin, and it is ridiculous if you give latria, worship towards the image, when that should go towards God. The calf, their God. And they gave credit to this idol for taking them out of the land of Egypt. Blasphemy. And Aaron committed the mortal sin of giving in and molding this golden idol. What does Josephus say? What does the 1 Maccabee say? What does the Talmud say? Jewish coins. What does the early church say? Here's a good question for Turretinfan that I was not able to ask him. When throughout history, the Exodus, Ezekiel, Maccabees, Josephus, the Apostolic era, when did images cease being used? When did they disappear from churches? When? Because if images, remember, veneration leads to godliness. Because if images were condemned, then we would have proof anytime during history when this stopped. Well, you know what? We're not going to use them anymore. We condemn them. They're all idolatry. When did that happen? It never happened. So the Protestant has themselves a very big problem on their hands. One, it's a novelty, what Francis Turretin says. I would rather stick with what the Bible says. I would rather stick with what the early church says. I would rather stick with what the early Jewish historian Josephus says. The text over and over talks about images that contribute to religious feeling, contrary to what the real Francis Turretin speaks of. If images in the most holy places don't lead you to religious feeling and veneration towards God, worship towards God, then I would suggest that you would read the text over again. Over and over, we've heard about what Francis Turretin had to say, and with all due respect, I don't think Francis Turretin was in tune with history, perhaps his modern-day history, but Francis Turretin went against Basil the Great, not acknowledging it, but in his writings, very similar to going definitely against what Basil says. Went against the Bible, was completely wrong, and went against ancient history. Images have always been used in veneration, in sacred services, in the religious, in the most holy, in the holiest of holy places. Whether you want to take it symbolic or not, in the book of Revelation, the ark is shown in heaven, statues in heaven. And that is a problem for Protestantism. That is a big problem for Protestant churches, and it's a problem that they're not going to overcome until they realize how out of tune with the ancient Word of God that they are, and how out of tune with early church history that they are. And I appreciate Turretinfan's time, and I thank Gus for being a fantastic moderator once again, and I will now surrender the rest of my time to my good friend Turretinfan. Thank you.
Okay, Turretinfan. So you have 7 minutes for your own closing statement. You can begin whenever you want.
Thanks very much. This has been a lively debate, and I appreciate that. I think that the key difference between idolatry and images is definitely the right distinction to make, and I think it's been done two different ways. One way says they're only idols when they're a false god, and another way says they're idols when they're objects of religious veneration, whether or not they represent the true God or a false God. The way that I proposed makes sense in terms of the golden calf, which was supposed to represent Jehovah, and it makes sense in terms of the golden calves of Jeroboam, which were also supposed to represent Jehovah, both of which were prohibited and both of which were wrong. It's not true that there was no visible representation of God at all before Moses. There were visible representations given to Abraham and to Jacob, for example, and Adam walked with God. There's plenty of, there were visible representations before then, so that's not the distinction. And there was no practice by the Jews even after Daniel's time until the temple, until Jesus was on earth. There were no representations of God among the Jews who believed, at least no representations of God that were authorized and welcomed by Scripture. Scripture never suggests we ought to venerate images, and on the contrary, always condemns such veneration of images. The images in a sacred space is a different question, and not the question of this debate. It may be a winnable debate, or maybe a debate that Mr. Albrecht would prefer to debate, and perhaps it's something for another time. I don't think it's a good topic of debate between us because it's an intra-Reformed debate. The question is the veneration of images. The question really is this argument which was made by the Second Council of Nicaea after the Iconoclastic Council, which did happen. Yes, it did happen that they said that these images are wrong and you shouldn't worship them. And then subsequently that council was condemned by this later council, and that one says, "For by so much more frequently as they are seen in artistic representation, by so much more readily are men lifted up to the memory of their prototypes, and to a longing after them, and to these should be given due salutation and honorable reverence." And there's a verb used that's based on proskuneo, which is that term that's translated honorable reverence. The reverence there is that term, and that's the worship that we're prohibited from giving to idols. And not indeed that true worship of faith, so they do draw a distinction between proskuneo generally and latria, but so that's that true worship of faith, which pertains alone to the divine nature, but to these, as to the figure of the precious and life-giving cross, and to the book of the Gospels, and to the other holy objects, incense and lights may be offered according to ancient pious custom. So they knew the difference between just having an image in a religious context, having carvings of pomegranates on the doors, and actually giving them proskuneo, offering them incense and candles. And that's the kind of thing we're condemning, this use of them for veneration purposes, and not just having a picture of something that's supposed to look like Moses or Paul. We have some separate issues with just even making pictures of Jesus, but that's a debate for another time. That's not the question here. The question here is the veneration of those images. The honor, according to that council, the honor which is paid to the image passes on to the thing the image represents. And I would assert to you that this is what all pagans and anyone who worships idols believes, that they're not worshiping the physical item, but the physical item represents something else. The interpretation of Aaron and the people of Israel's words as supposing that this golden calf, which they had just molded out of gold, was actually the thing that brought them out of Egypt, is absurd. And the fact that the argument has to be taken to that absurd place, I think, points out the inconsistency in the argument for which it was made. The Bible, as I pointed out, the Bible has this uniform teaching. Even the deuterocanonical books have a uniform teaching against the veneration of images. Do they mention images in a religious context in ways that aren't condemned? Sure, but that's not what we're debating. We're not debating having a golden lion standing outside your church door, although there might be some good reasons not to do that. And there might be reasons related to some other issue that might be inappropriate. And we're not called to reintroduce the temple worship and all the images that were found in there. So while God can ordain those things, and those can be appropriate for one time, for another time those might be inappropriate, because God appoints particular ways of worshiping at different times. We're not supposed to sacrifice animals anymore, not because sacrificing animals is bad because of animal rights or something like that. The reason is that's not the way we're supposed to worship God now, because Christ has come. So we have had a change in our worship because of the fact that Christ has come. But that change never included starting to make images and starting to venerate those images. That's not what the scriptures teach, and that's never mentioned by those early church fathers whom we mentioned. And the silence in that context cuts against this position. But the time when the veneration of images began to be introduced, it was opposed. Augustine opposed a creeping form of it early on, and this iconoclastic council countered the fully blown form later on. And again, we saw evidence that there were images used in religious context, things like a ichthus sign or an anchor sign used as a religious symbol to remind people of things, but not to venerate, not to light candles to it, not to burn incense to it, not to treat it like an idol. And that's the problem. These images of Christ, which are venerated, are being treated as idols. They're being treated as representing something else, and that you revere the image. That's what it says right here in the Second Nicene Council. It says, "He who reveres the image reveres it in it the subject represented." So when it's disingenuous to assert that the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church deny giving reverence to the image, because they do. That's exactly what the council states. It states that when you do that, you're actually reverencing the thing that the image represents. But you can't have that practice without the image, and without giving reverence. You initially give the reverence to the image, and that passes it on to the thing the image represents. That's the same way that all pagan idolatry works, except the most foolish pagans who actually literally think that the branch they just carved is God, or these absurd Israelites that supposedly believed that the statue they just made had previously, before they made it, brought them out of Egypt. So that, I think the ridiculousness of that argument speaks for itself. In short, the scriptures uniformly speak against the veneration of images. We're told never to proskuneo to them, yet the Second Nicene Council and the Roman Catholic Church teach that we ought to give proskuneo to them, and in that point, it's a direct contradiction between what Scripture teaches and what Rome teaches, and not just Rome. Many other churches that call themselves ancient also have the same error. So that concludes my speech.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you, William. It was really a very informative debate. I think you both made really, really great points.
Thank you.
So at this point, we're going to go ahead and invite callers. If you have any questions for either of these men on the issue of icons and their use in the act of worship, I guess, or their use in worship, please just press 1 if you're already on the line at 347-934-0379. If you're listening by the Six Springs hotline, which the number for that is 712-432-8710, dial 9925, and if you're on that hotline, just press 1 to unmute yourself so you can ask either William or Turretinfan some questions on the issue of this debate. And we do have somebody already who has pressed 1. All right, you're on the line. 830, you're on the air.
Hi, this question is for Turretinfan first, then William. If the second commandment doesn't allow images, why would there be images in heaven? I'll hang up and listen to the responses. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
What was that question? Is the second commandment? Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Both of you. She said, if the second commandment prohibits images, then why would there be images in heaven, she said.
So I continue to question whether that imagery in Revelation is meant to be understood literally. I think a lot of Revelation is allegorical. So when it talks about the feast, the marriage supper of the Lamb, it doesn't mean that Christ is going to appear with wool in heaven and that he's going to have, that he's going to chew the cud or something like that. It means it's using imagery allegorically. But let's say, hypothetically speaking, that I'm completely wrong, and there's going to be some kind of literal temple there, and there's even going to be a box of the Ark of the Covenant there. Although I point out that Hebrews and elsewhere in the New Testament we're encouraged not to maintain the old Ark of the Covenant, but instead to point those things forward to Christ. But even so, all that said, if there are statues of angels or statues of anything in heaven and in any part of heaven, whether that's the throne room of God himself or anywhere else, then those will be by God's appointment for the glory of God and so forth. And to the extent that God ordains those as part of his worship, I have no problem with God deciding how he's going to be worshipped, and that can include images. We know it can include images because even in the Old Covenant, there were images in the place of worship of God and connected with God's worship in terms of being part of the temple and so forth. So at least for that period, God had specifically commanded, and it would have been a sin not to include those images within that context. What was the distinction there, though, is that those images were never supposed to be venerated. And, for example, you weren't supposed to burn incense to them. So when the brass serpent was an image of a serpent, of presumably a statue, essentially, of a brass serpent, and that was ordained by God, and it was a good thing. But during the time of Hezekiah, the people of Israel began to burn incense to it, which is what Second Nicaea says you should do to icons of Christ. And Hezekiah is praised for destroying it when that came to that. So that's the difference. There's a difference in when there's religious veneration of something, that's inappropriate. But when just having it in the context of worship isn't inherently wrong. It might be wrong, and what Turretin is talking about is a little different issue. He's saying that it's wrong to, and this is quite a short summary of a long argument, but he's essentially saying that we're supposed to worship God exactly the way he said, and in the New Testament there's no longer any specific command for these kinds of things like pomegranates on the doors, and so we shouldn't go around carving pomegranates on our doors thinking that's going to please God, because God hasn't asked for that during this time period. So God could ask for it again in heaven, and in which case it would be just fine if he does. And if he asks for it in some future millennium, if I'm wrong in my eschatology and there's a future millennium on earth before heaven, then if he asks for it then, that would be fine too. As long as he asks for it, then it's okay. But Turretin's point is that he hasn't asked for it now.
That's a really good point. I think Turretin stands for that answer. I think he really got to the heart of the issue, although touching upon the caller's question, I disagree with Turretin's answer. I appreciate the fact that Turretin he asks how God is going to be worshipped. And he said that it can include images, which I appreciate that response. I think it does include images. God, it has always included images in the temple and churches, as we've seen already. And unfortunately, we weren't even able to touch upon Dura Europos. Or the catacombs, unfortunately. But the Turretin made a good point touching upon the serpent. The problem with that was the serpent was worshipped. It wasn't venerated in the positive sense of veneration. The positive usage, as I pointed out a number of times, of Eusebius, which literally is in the positive sense is to lead to godliness, is a form of positive veneration. But idolatry, I guess you can say it's a form of a negative form of veneration. It is idolatry against the commandments of God, and of course that is why the serpent was destroyed. But I agree with Turretin completely. There are a number of individuals that interpreted that chapter in Revelation in a symbolic manner. A number of them interpreted that ark to be literal. Which side would I fall upon? I've read the text a number of times. I don't see why it would not be interpreted as literally the ark in heaven. With that being said, we've got an image of the temple of God in heaven open, and we've got the Ark of the Covenant in heaven. So this debate, of course, is on the veneration of images in sacred or holy places. What does veneration mean? Veneration has a number of usages. It leads to godliness. It doesn't get any more sacred than having images in the temple of God. And even if this text is to be taken in an allegorical manner, as I think Turretinfan said that Origen did, although I've yet to see his interpretation of this verse. But let's just say that perhaps it was taken in an allegorical manner. Ezekiel 41, Chronicles, Kings, there are a number of other places where we know there were images in the holy of holiest places. So that in and of itself shows you that images were not condemned in the sacred locations. So I think the question was a very good question, and I think it gets to the heart of it, to the point of it. Again, veneration is used in a number of different ways. The Greek, as Turretinfan knows very well, doulia, is not the only term that can be used for veneration. There are a number of different terms. And that being said, I hope that we both gave long answers, and I hope they were both sufficient.
Anybody else, just press 1, or if you're on the 6 screens, press 1 to unmute yourself. I have a question, and I guess this is for William. Now, I served as a pastoral assistant in the Lutheran Church, and of course, we would bow before the altar. That is, the altar represents, of course, the temple altar. I think that there was much in the structure of a church in Lutheran settings or in liturgical settings,
yes.
Liturgical churches that are still very Catholic, and I think the intentional structure of churches, I guess by Gregory, was to implement that Old Testament type of temple sanctuary appearance. That is, that this is
That's
the
correct.
sanctuary behind the altar is the Holy of Holies, and that's where, of course, where the Eucharist is blessed. And of course, we did the same thing in the Lutheran Church, and then people would come and kneel and prostrate at the altar. Of course, within the Catholic setting, each one comes individually down the aisle.
Yes.
So, but my point is that, in saying all of that, is that we would bow to not necessarily to the cross, but also to the cross because it represents Jesus Christ.
Yes, correct.
Some could choose to bow to the Eucharist itself, and that's been controversial within the Catholic Church. Right now, there's a huge controversy about people not bowing to the sacrament, but
that's correct.
And they want to return to the respect for the sacrament. But the point is that now I can understand that because all of that is geared towards God, towards venerating God. That is that we know that
yes.
God is present in our midst,
correct.
and that this is intended. But how do we then? Is that veneration or is that actual worship? And if it involved, for example, an ancient saint, let's say a picture of Saint Nicholas or Saint Ignatius or whoever, and we know that people have actually kissed and bowed to a picture or which would be an icon of the saint. Wouldn't this be considered worship as well, or how do we distinguish the difference?
And that's a really, really, really good question. And to touch upon your point, I find it really interesting that you bring up a Lutheran church. And the one thing that I was unable to point out to in my cross-examination or my rebuttal or my opening statement is the real Francis Turretin. I believe, though, and Turretinfan can correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of his diatribe against images is actually directed towards Lutherans. Can you believe that? He actually says in his Institutes of Olympic Theology, Volume 2, he says, we affirm these against the Lutherans. So it's amazing that we, even at this early date and time, we've got Lutherans with images, religious images, in their sacred places. And this led to Francis Turretin being so upset at it. But going right back to your point, I think I love answering this with a quote from Basil the Great. And he actually says, how then, if one and one, are there not two gods? Because we speak of a king and of the king's image and not of two kings. And it is here that Basil begins his argument on venerating images. To make his point clear, his exposition begins on the icon, the image of the sun. He shows that whereas each person is one person, there are not two gods. He makes the point by speaking in images, express images and those of art. His point is that we speak of a king's image, but not of two kings when we speak of his image. He then says, the majesty is not cloven in two, nor the glory divided. And then here's what he says. He says, giving honor to an image does not divide any glory, because, as he continues, he says, the honor paid to the image passes on to the prototype. Now, what in the one case the image is by reason of imitation? And he continues going on, speaking of the image of the sun. And I've heard the argument used by those that contend that Basil is only speaking of the living image of the sun. But they're going to have a problem there, because Basil says, well, because that is true. He does speak of the living image of the sun, but he also makes it a point to say the honor paid to the image passes on to the prototype. And to make the point further, he emphasizes, he says, as in the works of art, the likeness is dependent on the form. So it's a fantastic point that venerating images at this early point in time amongst the Cappadocian father, this giant in patristic history, it was acceptable in a proper way, and any veneration of any image went directly towards the prototype. So it gets directly to the point. I know Turretinfan's going to have something to say about it, so I'll let him talk about that now.
Yeah, go ahead, Turretinfan.
Yeah, I think the ending portion of the quotation, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of what the objection is going to be. That he's talking about the Son being the image of the Father, he's not talking about some statue being an image of one of the persons of the Trinity. So and the fact that he uses that analogy to art demonstrates that he is not talking that his previous comment wasn't about art. It would be kind of absurd to say that the image of the art passes to the thing being portrayed in the art, just the way that an image of art passes to the thing that's being portrayed in the art. It would be absurd to make that your analogical argument by just pointing to the exact same thing you just said. So he is talking about the fact that it's not the worship of the Son doesn't derogate from the worship of the Father. Now, that is a similar argument that's used when it comes to adoring images, but Basil's not talking about adoring images there in terms of the type of images we're talking about. He's talking about the kind of thing we see in Colossians 1. And that does raise the point, which we didn't really get into in the debate, about kind of why it's problematical. But although it was problematical in the Old Testament to make images of Yahweh, it's even more problematical now because it does derogate the place that Christ has. I mean, we in that passage in Colossians 1, which it seems to be what Basil's referring to, he said Paul says in verse 14, in him we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. And so on. And what's interesting there is, if that's the image of God, the image of the invisible God, or the image of the Father, then when you make some painting, like the really amazing paintings that Michelangelo and other artists made, where they portray the Father, they're offering something instead. They're not offering Christ as the image of the invisible God. They're offering a painting, a ceiling, a fresco, or some other kind of image as the image of the invisible God. And that's not the main reason is just don't do it because God said don't do it, but this is an important point that would derogate. When you make a picture of the Father, that's not the image of the invisible God. Actually, the image of the invisible God is the real Christ. So,
yeah. I think Turretinfan is making a good point there, and whereas we do disagree, I disagree with him on his interpretation there of what Basil says. I do think he's talking about. I agree he's talking about the image of the Son, but I think he does as well make a point when he's speaking about images in general, images, artful images. But I think there's much more in Basil, which of course would be probably a contention amongst us. But I would recommend in any of the listening audience look up his sermon on the 40 martyrs. He shows that the honor is to be paid to these martyrs by making images of them. He says, let us show them forth in the sermon as if in a picture. And then he speaks of honoring them in many different ways. And of course, there are a number of different passages preserved in, I believe, John of Damascus of Basil, speaking of images in a positive manner, as well as Gregory of Nyssa and a number of other fathers. So even if I were to grant that Basil is not speaking solely about images here, but it's simply, actually, if I were to grant that he's only speaking about the image of the Son here, even if I were to grant that, there are a number of other places where Basil does speak of images in a positive manner, which would be equivalent to that of veneration. But I do agree with a number of things that Turretinfan has said, though. I do disagree on one thing, though, and I think we probably will never agree on that. I don't think that an image or an icon, per se, or a statue is automatically tantamount to being an idol, unless an individual, actually, even if an individual were to give perhaps latria towards that image ignorantly, that would not in and of itself make it wholesale an idol, just because that individual is worshiping it as such. And I think that's a point that I know that I think he brought up Nicaea earlier. I know we're not going to have enough time. We're almost running out of time to go into that. But I would point out that revering the image, which is what Nicaea 2 is talking about. It's talking about an icon. We can all look up the original language here. It's not talking about the actual paper or marble or whatever the image is made out of, but it's speaking of revering the image and in a sense, sending the dulia to the actual individual, because we believe those that have departed, we believe that we're all connected to the body of Christ. So we can actually give religious service in a sense of dulia, in the sense of what Galatians says, to a departed brethren. And I would argue that this is nothing different than what Basil was saying in giving honor to images in his time. I think it's the exact same thing, and I find it very interesting that we in the first full wholesale form of Protestantism, actually differs much from Protestantism, but in the first protester, if you will, major protester, Luther, we have even Francis Turretin is up in arms against him, and his whole diatribe is focused against Lutherans, which, as we can see, had no problem with the veneration of images in sacred places.
Right. Well, that to say they had no problem is, it may be going no problem at all. Might be a little bit far, but certainly Lutheranism didn't fully reform on that topic, and they also maintained the same enumeration that the Catholic Catechism and the Catechism of the Council of Trent has in terms of labeling the First Commandment as including both the first and second, and splitting the 10th into two commandments. So that same issue does arise in the Lutheran churches, but that's the big thing that separated the Lutherans from Roman Catholics were sola scriptura and justification by faith alone. And those are much, although this is an important issue, and it can lead to all kinds of problems when you start introducing worship of images. Those are even more central to what divides us.
I agree with you.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Turretinfan because, I pastor a fundamentalist Baptist church, and behind our baptismal we have a mural of John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. And actually, when I showed the mural on Facebook, someone actually made a judgment about, oh, that's a violation of the use of images.
Right.
And so I'm just, I'm not really that familiar with the regulatory principles of worship. Is the abstention from images part and parcel of the RPW?
So the short answer, yes. The point is that so the regulative principle says that God is not to be worshipped according to any way that he hasn't appointed, and that for now he hasn't appointed all kinds of animal sacrifices and so forth. And if he had, it would be fine, because that's what he said. But since he hasn't, it's not fine, and we can't go around sacrificing cows, and including that as part of the religious worship of God. And among those things that are not appropriate as worship of God is making of any picture of God. And that question of whether you can even make pictures of God is it's an important aspect of the Second Commandment, but it's a more debatable point. And as you've observed, many Protestant or Reformed people have less of an issue or question whether the Second Commandment is also intended to apply to images of God that aren't intended to be venerated. And that example of the baptismal mural is a great example of an image that isn't venerated. I mean, no one goes and puts candles in front of it and lights incense to it. It's not being worshipped, and people can see the difference between the way that's treated. And if they go to any Orthodox church and look at the icons of Mary and Jesus in the two side altars or icon stands that they have there, I mean, people can see the difference between the way you treat that mural and the way you treat those icons. And that, our debate's about that type of treatment of icons and not about whether you can even have a picture that's supposed to be of Jesus. But yes, the traditional Reformed view, as expressed in the Westminster Standards and as held, I believe, by both Turretin and Calvin, was that you shouldn't even make them for those purposes, just historical purposes. And at least from a prudential standpoint, it seems like those kinds of pictures are kind of a stepping stone which tempt people to take it to the next level of starting to venerate those images, although frequently people don't. So I'm guessing, but I bet that they never did any actual veneration of those images in the church you went to. And people probably would have objected if someone went and spray painted over the picture, and it does have some religious significance. And it's not just a person getting baptized, a random person. It's supposed to represent God. But, but people aren't thinking of it in terms of trying to venerate it. And although it's a little bit of a fuzzy area, people can tell the difference. So, yeah. So long answer to...
I just want to make sure we get our last call because we're down to the last 3 minutes. So, 830, you're on the air.
Okay, I have a question. This question is for both. Is veneration the same thing as worship?
That's a good question. You want me to tackle that first, Turretinfan, or you want to go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
You want to grab that? Okay, I'll try and answer that fast. I know we're down to the last 2 minutes. No, veneration is not the same thing as worship. Veneration can be worship, and it should be worship whenever we direct it towards God. But in the sense of the veneration as we're speaking about in this debate, no, it is not the exact same thing as worship, because when an ancient Christian, an Orthodox, or a Roman Catholic or Catholic in general would speak about veneration of a saint, they're speaking of giving a religious service in the sense of dulia, and that in that sense would not be the same thing. But when we're speaking about veneration of images, we're speaking about images used in religious or sacred contexts that lead to godliness. Anything that is in a sacred location, that in and of itself is, as the Greek word eusebias speaks of, that is supposed to lead to godliness. That is a form of veneration. So in that sense, that is veneration, and that is biblical and historical. And I know the time is running out, so I'm going to let Turretinfan give you a quick answer.
Yeah, so, so from our standpoint, the term worship, there is a difference between any kind of, there's other kinds of veneration besides religious veneration. So, you may love some specific sports team, you may venerate the players that are on that sports team for their great athletic skill, but that's not a religious veneration and it's not worship. So veneration is a broad category, of which religious veneration is a narrow category. And although we recognize that Roman Catholics make a distinction between latria and dulia and so forth. We don't accept that distinction is fully legitimate, and we think that it's just essentially a way of excusing venerating things that aren't God and just saying, well, we don't call it God, so it's okay for us to offer this kind of veneration to them. So we don't accept that distinction, although we recognize it's made, and we don't accept that it's a valid distinction. And we classify all of those under proskuneo, which is this term that the Nicaea itself used, Second Nicaea used. So we feel it's like a fair characterization as well.
Yeah, that actually for many listeners, for our ex-witnesses, the argument that sounds very familiar that the witnesses use to try to say Jesus didn't receive divine worship, betrayal, and so they try to say that proskuneo is not divine worship, but depending on the context, proskuneo can apply to divine worship.
Yes.
We're at the close of the debate. I just want to go ahead and thank you both for coming on, and Six Green is going to be taking over with the next program. I just want to let everybody know, next Saturday we have at 1 o'clock a special guest. It's going to be James Walker from Watchman Fellowship, and we're going to talk about zeitgeist mythicists and new atheism. And a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses are drawn to militant atheism, particularly of zeitgeist mythicism. And so we're going to talk about that next week with James Walker from Watchman Fellowship. Right now we're going to turn it over to Rick, and he's going to go ahead and introduce the next program. Thank you both for a great debate. And everybody just listen in the archives if you want to listen to today's debate at www.blogtalkradio.com/healingxoutreach. God bless.
Well, hello everyone and welcome in. If you can hear me, Rick Farron here at the Six Screens. I believe you can all hear me. Let me just disconnect. Let me just see what's going on here with Blog Talk, but I believe I am on right now. I do know you can hear me, so we want to thank you for coming in. Okay, good. Thank you, Augustine. Very good. Thank you. Thank you for coming on today to your program, Augustine. Thank you, and the two gentlemen as well. Well, we're now going to the Six Screens Telenetwork. We have got Josh, of course, is not with us. Last week he only went to the emergency room. He had some medical issues that he just came quickly on the program to talk about, and then he said he was going to be in for a while, and we have not heard from him. We may...
Don't get fooled by cut-rate networks. Verizon is America's only #1 network according to Root Metrics. Join today and get up to $650 when you trade in your phone to cover your cost to switch. Verizon. Better matters. New smartphone device payment purchase import and required. Get up to $650 prepaid card for installment plan balance less trade-in value, or up to $350 prepaid card for early termination fees less trade-in value. Trade-in must be in good working and cosmetic condition and be worth more than $0. Line must remain active for 6 months, subject to VZW agreements, calling plan, and credit approval. Rankings based on 2016 first half Root Metrics U.S. National Root Score Report of 4 mobile networks. Results may vary. Visit rootmetrics.com.